My Arthur, he never wanted his picture taken, not once in the 50 years I knew him. He'd always say, "Eleanor, a photograph just freezes a moment. But a memory breathes." And so, he left me with a lifetime of breathing memories, so many that on quiet nights like this one, the silence in our little house feels like a gentle sigh, full of everything he ever was. He was a man who worked with his hands, a man who believed that the truth of a thing was found in its smallest, most hidden parts. He was a watchmaker, you see. And all our years together, they tick by now, not on a clock on the wall, but right here, in my heart, a rhythm only I can hear. We met in Willow Creek, a town so small you could hold its entire map in the palm of your hand. It was just after the world had seemed to exhale a long, tired breath. There was a feeling in the air back then, a fragile kind of hope, as if everyone had agreed to start over, to build something quiet and sturdy. I was working at the town's only diner, pouring coffee that was probably too strong and serving pie that was always too sweet. He came in one afternoon, not for the food, but because the old clock on the wall, the one with the painted geese that flew in a circle, had stopped at 3:15. He didn't say much. He just looked at it, his head tilted, as if he were listening to a secret. He had this way about him, a stillness that made you feel like the rest of the world was spinning too fast. He had kind eyes, the color of a faded blueprint, and hands that were surprisingly graceful for a man so tall. He asked my boss, Mr. Henderson, if he could take a look. An hour later, with tiny tools I'd never seen before laid out on a piece of felt, the geese were flying again, and the clock was chiming a sound I hadn't heard in years. He didn't ask for a penny. He just packed his tools, gave a small nod, and left. I found out later he'd just moved to town, renting the little dusty shopfront on Main Street that had been empty since the old tailor passed. He was setting up a place to mend time. That's what I used to think of it as. He wasn't just fixing watches, he was mending people's time. He'd taken a grandfather's pocket watch that hadn't ticked since the war, a lady's delicate silver timepiece with a cracked face, and he'd bring them back. He'd give people back their little piece of history, their connection to a moment they thought was lost forever. I started taking my coffee breaks over there, just to watch him work. The shop smelled of old wood, brass polish, and a faint, clean scent of mineral oil. It was a quiet place. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic ticking of a dozen different clocks, all beating with their own tiny hearts. He would sit at his workbench, a jeweler's loupe pressed to his eye, looking like a surgeon operating on the soul of a machine. He moved with a patience that was both fascinating and deeply calming. He didn't talk much at first. I did most of the talking, telling him about the people in town, the gossip from the diner, my silly dreams of one day seeing the ocean. He would just listen, his focus entirely on the tiny, intricate world under his lens. But sometimes, he would look up, and the smile that would touch his lips was so genuine, so warm, it felt like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. Our courtship was as quiet and steady as he was. It wasn't made of grand gestures or fancy dates. It was made of shared silences in his shop, of him walking me home after my shift, the sound of our footsteps echoing on the empty streets. It was in the way he'd save me the last piece of cherry pie at the diner, or the way I'd bring him a hot thermos of coffee on a cold morning. He told me once, while mending the delicate chain on a locket of mine, that he believed everything had its own perfect rhythm. You just have to be patient enough to find it, he'd said. I think, in our own quiet way, we were finding ours. The day he asked me to marry him, it was raining. A soft, steady autumn rain that made the whole world seem gray and hushed. He didn't have a diamond ring. He had something better. He'd been working on it for weeks, he told me. It was a watch. A lady's watch, with a face of mother of pearl and a simple leather strap. But it wasn't the watch itself that made me cry. It was the back. He had engraved it, in the tiniest, most perfect script I had ever seen. It didn't say, "I love you." It said, For all our time. For all our time. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A promise. He believed in things that lasted. Not just gears and springs, but people. Love. He believed in the quiet, everyday rhythm of a life shared. We were married in the little town hall, with just a handful of friends. I wore a simple blue dress, and he wore his best suit. He slipped the watch onto my wrist, and I have never, not for a single day, taken it off. Its ticking has been the soundtrack to my life, a constant, gentle reminder of the promise made on a rainy day in a little town in Ohio. We moved into this small house on Elm Street, the one with the porch swing and the big oak tree in the front yard. It wasn't much, but it was ours. We filled it, not with fancy things, but with the quiet hum of our life together. Arthur's business, time and tide watch repair, never made us rich, but it gave us enough. It was more than a job for him, it was his art, his calling. He knew the history of every family in town by the watches they brought him. He'd hold a piece in his hand and say, "Ah, this is a 1948 Elgin. Belonged to old man Hemlock's father. See the scratch here." That's where he dropped it the day he got the news his son was coming home. He saw stories in the scratches and scuffs, in the worn leather and the faded gold. Our first few years were like a beautiful, simple melody. We'd have dinner together every night. I'd read to him while he sketched out designs for a complicated repair. We'd sit on the porch swing in the summer, watching the fireflies, not needing to say a word. We were happy. A deep, uncomplicated, quiet kind of happy. We didn't need grand adventures. Our adventure was the life we were building, day by day, tick by tock. Then came the day our melody gained a new, beautiful note. The day we found out we were going to have a child. I remember telling Arthur. He was at his workbench, reassembling the insides of a carriage clock. I stood in the doorway of the shop, my heart beating so fast I was sure he could hear it. When I told him, he put down his tweezers, very slowly. He took the loop from his eye and just looked at me. He didn't shout or jump for joy. That wasn't his way. He just stood up, walked over to me, and wrapped his arms around me, holding me so tightly I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. He rested his chin on the top of my head and whispered, "A new time is beginning for us, Eleanor." And it was. It truly was. The quiet house on Elm Street was about to be filled with a new kind of music. Our son, Samuel, arrived in the spring, when the dogwood trees were in full bloom, scattering their white petals like confetti all over town. He was a perfect little miracle, with a tuft of hair the color of corn silk and his father's serious, observant eyes. The quiet house was quiet no more. It was filled with laughter, with the babble of a baby learning to talk, with the sound of tiny feet learning to run across the wooden floors. Arthur was transformed. The quiet, reserved watchmaker became a man who would get down on his hands and knees to play with wooden blocks, a man who could spend an hour just watching his son discover the magic of his own toes. The shop changed, too. Samuel's playpen was set up in a corner, surrounded by a fortress of ticking clocks. Customers would come in and smile, seeing our little boy amidst the gears and springs of his father's world. Arthur made him a mobile to hang over his crib, crafted from old, polished clock hands and brass wheels that spun and caught the light. Samuel would lie there for hours, mesmerized, as if he understood the intricate beauty of it all. It felt like our life was a perfect machine, every gear clicking into place, everything running in perfect, harmonious time. Those years are a blur of warmth and light in my memory. Picnics by the creek, Samuel's first day of school, the Christmas he got his first bicycle. Arthur taught him how to skip stones, how to identify the constellations in the night sky. I taught him how to bake cookies, how to read. Our life wasn't extraordinary to anyone on the outside, but to us, it was everything. It was a universe contained within the walls of our small house and the town of Willow Creek. Samuel was our sun, our moon, and all our stars. He loved the watch shop. He'd sit on a stool beside Arthur, his little face a mask of concentration, watching his father work. Arthur started teaching him, letting him polish a casing or sort tiny screws. "He has the hands for it, Ellie," Arthur would say to me in the evenings, a rare pride in his voice. "He has the patience." We imagined, in that quiet way of ours, that one day it would be time and tide and sun. The thought was a comfort, a sense of continuation, a legacy not of wealth, but of skill, of patience, of mending what was broken. But time, the very thing my husband spent his life trying to measure and repair, can be a cruel and unpredictable force. It doesn't always move forward in a steady, reliable rhythm. Sometimes, it shatters. Samuel was 8. It was a Saturday in October, the kind of crisp, brilliant autumn day that feels like a gift. The leaves were a riot of red and gold, and the air was sharp with the smell of wood smoke. He had gone to play at his friend Billy's house, just 2 streets over. He rode his bicycle, the one he was so proud of. He turned and waved to me from the end of the street, his smile as bright as the afternoon sun. That smile is the last living photograph I have of him in my mind. The rest is a fog of sirens, of frantic phone calls, of a cold, sterile hospital waiting room where all the clocks on the walls seemed to have stopped. There was an accident. A car that came too fast around a blind corner. It's strange, the details you remember, and the ones your mind mercifully erases. I remember the squeak of a nurse's shoes on the linoleum floor. I remember the terrible, artificial green of the waiting room chairs. I remember Arthur's hand holding mine, his grip so tight it hurt, but I didn't care. It was the only thing holding me together. When the doctor came in, his face told us everything before his words did. The world didn't just stop. It broke. The perfect machine of our life, all its delicate gears and balances, shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. We went home to a house that was suddenly, cavernously silent. His little coat was still hanging on the hook by the door. His glass of milk was half full on the kitchen table. The entire house had become a museum of a life that was no longer there. Grief is a strange, solitary country. Even when you are with someone you love, you are there alone. Arthur and I, who had built a life on shared silences, were now lost in a new kind of silence. A heavy, suffocating silence filled with everything we couldn't say. He went back to the shop. He buried himself in his work, in the meticulous, controllable world of tiny movements and predictable outcomes. He would sit at his bench for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, his eye pressed to his loop, shutting out the world, shutting out the pain, shutting me out. He was trying to mend time, but he couldn't mend this. This was a break that no amount of skill or patience could ever fix. I tried to talk to him, to reach him, but it was like shouting across a canyon. He would just nod, his eyes distant, lost in some intricate mechanism I couldn't see. The shop, once a place of comfort, became his fortress, and I was on the outside. My own grief was a wild, messy thing. I would find myself standing in Samuel's room, just touching his things, a toy car, a well-read book. I would sit on his bed and cry until I had no tears left. I needed to talk, to scream, to remember, but Arthur couldn't bear it. Any mention of Samuel's name would make him flinch, his jaw tightening as he turned back to his work. So we lived side by side, 2 ghosts in a house full of memories. We still ate dinner together, we still slept in the same bed, but the space between us was vast and cold. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by a shared, unspoken sorrow that was too heavy to carry together. The town of Willow Creek, once our cozy little universe, became a landscape of painful reminders. The park where Samuel learned to swing, the candy store where he'd spend his allowance, the schoolyard he used to run across. Every corner held a ghost. Years passed like this. Slowly, painfully. The sharp edges of grief began to dull, worn down by the relentless turning of the seasons. It didn't disappear, not ever. It just became a part of us, a shadow that walked with us always. We grew older. The lines on our faces deepened, our hair turned to silver. We found a new rhythm, a quiet, somber cadence that was nothing like the joyful melody of our early years, but it was a rhythm nonetheless. We learned to navigate around the hole in our lives, to live with the silence. There were moments, small flickers of the love that was still there, buried beneath all the pain. One evening, I was in the kitchen, trying to open a stubborn jar of pickles, my hands aching with arthritis. I was getting so frustrated, tears welling in my eyes, not for the jar, but for everything. For the weakness in my hands, for the emptiness in the house, for the years we had lost to sadness. Arthur came in from the living room, took the jar from me without a word, and opened it with a single, practiced twist. He set it on the counter. Then he took my hands in his calloused watchmaker's thumbs gently rubbing my swollen knuckles. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like a decade. His eyes, those faded blueprint eyes, were filled with a sorrow that matched my own. He didn't say anything. He just held my hands for a long moment. And in that silence, I understood. He was still there. We were still there. We were broken, yes, but we were still together. The town changed. The diner where we met was sold and turned into a yoga studio. Mr. Henderson retired and moved to Florida. New families moved in, their children's laughter echoing in the streets, a sound that was both painful and, in a strange way, healing. Life went on, as it always does. Arthur's shop became a kind of institution, a relic from another time. Young people with their digital watches had no use for him, but there were always enough people who cherished the old ways, who understood the value of something made to last. One afternoon, a young woman came into the shop. She brought an old, battered pocket watch. It was her grandfather's, she said, and it had been his father's before him. It hadn't worked in 50 years. She didn't have much money, but she hoped he could just make it tick again. Arthur took the watch, opened its back, and peered inside. He worked on it for a week. When she came back to pick it up, he handed it to her, ticking as steadily as the day it was made. She held it to her ear, and her eyes filled with tears. "It sounds just like I remember," she whispered. She asked him how much she owed. Arthur just shook his head. "No charge," he said gruffly. Some things are not about the money." As she left, I saw a look on his face I hadn't seen since before we lost Samuel. It was a look of quiet purpose, of peace. He wasn't just mending a watch. He was mending a connection. He was keeping a memory alive. And I realized, in that moment, that this was how he had survived. This was his way of fighting back against the time that was stolen from us. The final chapter of our time together began as quietly as the first. It started with a tremor in his hand. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight, intermittent shaking he could control. But for a watchmaker, a man whose entire life and livelihood depended on the rock-steady precision of his fingers, it was a catastrophe. He tried to hide it from me, clenching his fist when he thought I wasn't looking, or bracing his wrist against the edge of his workbench. But I saw it. I saw the frustration in his eyes, the fear. The man who could command the tiniest of gears was losing control of his own body. The shop, his sanctuary, became a place of torment. A simple repair that once took him an hour now took him a day. He would drop tiny screws, his tweezers clattering against the floor. I would hear his soft, frustrated sighs from the house. It was a slow, cruel erosion of the very essence of who he was. The doctors gave it a name, a long, clinical word that meant very little. All it meant to us was that things were changing, and inevitable, final winding down. He fought it, of course. He was a proud, stubborn man. He refused to give up his work. But the day came when he was trying to set a jewel into a delicate lady's watch, and his hand shook so violently that he scratched the watch face. He just stared at it, at the ugly white line he had carved into the pristine surface. He slowly put down his tools. He took off his loupe and set it on the bench. He stood up, walked to the front of the shop, turned the sign on the door from open to closed, and locked it. He never went back to his workbench again. The silence in our house changed once more. It was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken silence of our middle years. It became a tender, watchful silence. The roles we had played for so long began to reverse. I, who had so often felt like the fragile one, became his rock. He, the steady, capable man who had fixed everything, now needed me for the simplest of things. Buttoning his shirt. Holding a cup of coffee steady for him. My days became a rhythm of care, of small, quiet acts of love. In a way I never would have expected, this slow decline brought us closer than we had been in 30 years. The wall of unspoken grief, which had stood between us for so long, began to crumble. With his life's work taken from him, he had nowhere left to hide. He had only the present moment, and I was there with him. We started talking again. Not about the big, painful things, not at first. We talked about the weather, about the neighbors, about stories in the newspaper. But slowly, tentatively, we started to talk about the past. One afternoon, we were sitting on the porch swing, and he turned to me. His voice was softer now, a little reedy. "Do you remember," he said, "that mobile I made for his crib? With the brass wheels?" My heart stopped for a second. It was the first time he had said the word his in decades. I swallowed and said, "Yes, Arthur. I remember. It was beautiful." He loved it. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I used the hands from my father's old railway clock for that," he said. I wanted him to have a piece of his history. And just like that, a door that had been locked for an eternity creaked open. We started to share memories of Samuel, small, precious fragments we had each kept locked away. The way he used to wrinkle his nose when he laughed. The sound of his voice calling for us in the morning. It was painful, of course, but it was a cleansing pain. We were finally grieving together. His last few months were spent mostly in his favorite armchair by the window, looking out at the old oak tree in the yard. His body was failing, but his mind, in its own way, was clear. The past and present began to blend for him. Sometimes he would talk to me as if we were still young, still dreaming of opening the shop. Other times, he would look at me with a profound clarity, his eyes full of the 50 years we had shared. One evening, I was helping him get ready for bed. He was frail, a shadow of the strong man he once was. He caught my wrist, his fingers trembling, and brought my hand up so he could see the watch he had given me all those years ago. Its face was scratched now, the leather strap worn smooth and dark with age, but it was still ticking. Always ticking. He looked at it, then he looked at me. "It kept good time, didn't it, Ellie?" he whispered. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, tears streaming down my face. "All our time," I managed to say. He squeezed my hand, a flicker of his old strength, and then he closed his eyes. He passed away a few days later, in his sleep, as peacefully as one of his old clocks finally winding down. The silence that followed his death was the most profound of all. It was absolute. The house, our little ark, felt empty and vast. For weeks, I just moved through the days and a daze, the world outside my window seeming distant and unreal. The only constant was the watch on my wrist. Tick. Tock. A tiny, faithful heartbeat against my skin. Now, I sit here in his armchair, the one that still holds the faint scent of him, of oil and old paper. The house is quiet, yes. But it's not an empty silence anymore. It's filled with the breathing memories he left me. I can see him at his workbench, his head bent in concentration. I can hear the echo of Samuel's laughter in the hallway. I can feel the warmth of Arthur's hand holding mine on the porch swing. I look down at the watch. The mother-of-pearl face seems to glow in the lamplight. For all our time. He was a watchmaker. He knew that time isn't just about seconds and minutes and hours. It's about the quality of those moments. The joy, the sorrow, the love, the struggle. It all gets wound up inside us, and it becomes the story of our lives. My Arthur, he didn't leave me with photographs. He left me with something so much more real. He left me with the understanding that a life isn't measured by its length, but by its depth. It isn't about how many years you have, but what you fill them with. Our life was filled with a quiet, ordinary love. It was filled with a joy so bright it felt like it could light up the world. And it was filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like it could drown us. But we endured. We held on. The little watch on my wrist is more than a machine for telling time. It's a vessel. It holds the rainy afternoon he proposed. It holds the moment I told him we were having a baby. It holds the years of quiet grief and the final, precious months of rediscovery. It holds all of our time. And as long as it keeps ticking, as long as I am here to listen, our story isn't over. It just keeps on breathing. My husband, Thomas, used to say that you could read a man's life story in the palms of his hands. His own were like two maps of a rugged coastline, etched with the fine lines of 1,000 tides and calloused from a lifetime of shaping wood. They weren't soft, gentle hands. They were tools. They were instruments of creation, stained with varnish and scarred by the slip of a chisel, but they were the kindest hands I have ever known. When he held my face, I could feel the grain of his life against my skin, and in his touch, I felt the unwavering strength of the man he was. He was a boat builder. And the story of our life together was carved, plank by plank, into the very heart of the vessels he sent out to sea from our little corner of the world in Port Blossom, Maine. I was a librarian back then, a girl who lived more in the pages of books than in the world itself. My life was ordered by the Dewey Decimal System, a quiet, predictable existence. His life was governed by the wind and the water, by the phases of the moon that pulled the tides. He'd come into the library on stormy winter afternoons, not to borrow a book, but just to sit in the warmth and sketch designs on scraps of paper. He smelled of salt and sawdust, a scent so different from the dry, papery smell of my world that it felt like an adventure all on its own. He was a man of few words, and I was a woman who loved them. It seemed an unlikely pairing. He would sit for an hour, his brow furrowed in concentration, the only sound the scratching of his pencil. I would watch him from behind my desk, this tall, quiet man with shoulders as broad as a ship's beam and eyes the color of the sea just before a storm. He never looked up, but I think he knew I was watching. There was a current between us, an unspoken understanding that flowed through the quiet air of that old library. One day, he left one of his sketches behind. It was a drawing of a small dory, but rendered with such exquisite detail you could almost feel the spray on your face. On the back, in a blocky, draftsman's script, were 3 words, "For the librarian." The next day, I walked down to the harbor, to the big, weathered barn of a building that was Anderson's boatyard. I found him there, surrounded by the skeletal ribs of a half-finished sailboat, planing a long plank of cedar. The rhythmic scrape of the tool was the only sound, sending fragrant curls of wood onto the floor. I held out the drawing. He stopped his work and wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving faint dusty smudges. He didn't smile, not exactly, but the intensity in his eyes softened. "You came," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And that's how it began. Not with a flurry of dates or fancy words, but with me spending my afternoons at the boatyard, reading aloud to him as he worked. I'd read him tales of the sea, Melville and Conrad, and he would work, his movements economical and precise, his focus absolute. He spoke through his hands, through the way he could coax a stubborn piece of oak into a perfect, elegant curve. Our courtship was a slow build, like one of his boats. It was sturdy, deliberate, and meant to last. He showed me how to read the weather in the clouds, how to tie knots that would never give way. I taught him about the worlds hidden in books, about poetry and history. We were learning each other's languages. The day he asked me to marry him, we were walking on the beach at low tide, the sand littered with seaweed and shells. He didn't get down on one knee. He just stopped and picked up a piece of driftwood, worn smooth and silver by the sea. He turned to me and said, "Margaret, I want to build a life with you. One that's as strong and simple as this." He didn't have a ring. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved sandpiper, fashioned from the same cedar he used in his boats. Its tiny painted eye seemed to look right at me. That was his proposal. That was his heart, offered up in a form he understood. We were married in the little clapboard church on the hill, overlooking the harbor. The whole town came. Fishermen with weathered faces stood next to summer people in their bright clothes. It felt like we were weaving our lives into the fabric of this place, this town that lived and breathed with the ocean. We bought a small house, a salt box with gray shingles that rattled in the wind, just a short walk from the boatyard. Our life settled into a rhythm. Thomas would leave before dawn, and I would wake to the scent of the coffee he'd left for me. I'd see him later in the day, a distant figure in the boatyard, moving with a familiar, steady grace. Our evenings were quiet, spent by the fire, the sound of the foghorn from the lighthouse a mournful, comforting lullaby. We didn't need much. We had the sea, we had his work, and we had each other. Then came Rose, our daughter. She arrived in the middle of a blizzard, as if to announce that she would be a force of nature all her own. Holding her for the first time, I felt a love so fierce it was almost painful. Thomas was mesmerized. He would hold her tiny hand in his enormous one, his calloused finger completely enveloped by her grasp, and a look of such profound wonder would cross his face. He, the builder of strong, practical things, had created something impossibly delicate and perfect. Rose grew up with sawdust in her hair and the scent of the sea in her clothes. The boatyard was her playground. She'd make little boats out of wood scraps and sail them in tide pools. Thomas adored her. He was not a demonstrative man, but his love for her was in every action. It was in the perfectly balanced swing he built for her in the backyard, in the little wooden animals he'd carve and leave on her pillow at night. She was the light of our lives, the bright, vibrant sail on the sturdy vessel of our family. We felt anchored, secure. We believed, with the simple faith of two people in love, that our life would always be this way, held safe in the quiet harbor of our little town. Childhood is a fast-running tide. You blink, and it has already turned. Our little Rose, the girl who loved the smell of cedar and the feel of sand between her toes, grew into a young woman with a restless energy that our small town could no longer contain. Her world, once centered on the boatyard and the shoreline, expanded rapidly. It was filled with music I didn't recognize, books I hadn't read, and dreams that pointed far away from the salt-sprayed shingles of Port Blossom. The first signs of the coming storm were small. She started to see her father's work not as an art, but as a trade. She saw the town not as a home, but as a cage. "Don't you ever want to see anything else?" she'd ask me, her eyes full of a yearning I recognized from the heroines in the novels I used to love. "Don't you want to live in a place where things are happening?" I would try to explain the beauty of our quiet life, the dignity in her father's craft, but my words sounded old-fashioned and hollow, even to my own ears. The real rift, the deep, painful crack, formed between her and Thomas. They were too much alike, in their own ways. Both stubborn, both proud, both unable to speak the language of their own hearts. Thomas saw her restlessness as a rejection of everything he was, everything he had built. He couldn't understand why the life that had given him so much purpose and contentment was something she was so desperate to escape. He would try to connect with her the only way he knew how, through his work. He started building her a sailboat, a beautiful, sleek vessel he called the Wild Rose. He poured all of his love, his hopes, and his fears for her into its creation. He envisioned them sailing it together, out past the lighthouse, believing that on the open water, they might find their way back to each other. But Rose saw the boat as just another anchor, another chain meant to hold her here. The day he unveiled it for her, on her 17th birthday, was a disaster. It was a perfect boat, a masterpiece of his craft. But she just stared at it, her arms crossed. "It's beautiful, Dad," she said, but her voice was flat. "But what am I going to do with a boat? I'm leaving. I'm going to college in Boston. I'm going to study art history." I will never forget the look on Thomas's face. It wasn't anger. It was a deep, profound hurt, as if one of his own ribs had been splintered. He had offered her his soul, carved in wood and shaped by his own hands, and she had politely refused it. He just nodded slowly, his jaw tight, and walked back into the workshop without another word. The beautiful boat, the Wild Rose, sat in the yard for years, covered by a tarp, a monument to a conversation that never happened. Rose left for Boston that fall. The house fell silent, the void she left behind a palpable presence. Our life, which had once felt so full and complete, now seemed diminished. Thomas retreated even further into his work. He took on more commissions, working from before sunrise until long after dark. The boatyard was his fortress, a place where the world made sense, where effort and skill yielded a predictable, tangible result. Our home became just a place where he ate and slept. The easy companionship we had shared was replaced by the weariness of two people navigating a shared loss they couldn't speak about. The phone calls from Rose became less frequent. Her visits were short, obligatory stops on her way to somewhere else. She was building a life for herself in the city, a life of galleries and museums, of friends who talked about art and philosophy. We didn't fit into that world. When she did come home, the air was thick with unspoken things. She would look at her father's calloused hands with a kind of pity, and he would look at her fashionable city clothes and carefully styled hair as if she were a stranger. I was the frantic, failing diplomat between two hostile nations, trying to translate, trying to explain, trying to mend a break that just kept getting wider. "He doesn't even try to understand me," she would tell me in hushed, frustrated tones in the kitchen. And later, Thomas would say to me, his back turned as he stared out at the dark water, "She thinks we're simple people, Margaret. She's ashamed of us." Both were right, and both were wrong. The love was still there, buried deep beneath layers of pride, misunderstanding, and years of silence. But it was so deep we could no longer feel its warmth. Those were the lonely years. I felt like I was living on an island, with my husband on one shore and my daughter on another, and the sea between them was too wide and stormy for me to cross. I missed the girl who made boats out of driftwood. And I missed the man who would listen to me read for hours, his presence a warm, steady comfort. Thomas and I were like two old ships moored side by side, swaying in the same water but never truly touching. The silence in our house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the sound of absence. The sound of a family that had lost its way. We were adrift, and none of us, least of all the master boat builder, knew how to find the shore. The sea, which had given us our life, also signaled its final, difficult turn. It began not with a storm, but with a tremor. Thomas was carrying a heavy piece of oak, something he had done 10,000 times before, when his legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto the sawdust-covered floor of the workshop, the wood clattering beside him. He insisted it was nothing, that he'd just slipped, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He, a man who had always been the master of his own body, a man whose strength was as reliable as the morning tide, was facing a betrayal from within. The diagnosis was a string of cold, medical terms that boiled down to one simple, brutal fact: the strength was leaving him. A degenerative condition was slowly stealing the power from his muscles, the sureness from his hands. The first thing to go was his work. He tried to fight it, of course. He would sit on a stool, his hands shaking, trying to guide a chisel along a line he could barely see. The frustration was a poison. The workshop, his lifelong sanctuary, became his prison. The scent of cedar and varnish, once a comfort, now smelled of failure. The day he finally gave up was a gray, windswept Tuesday. I found him just sitting on the floor of the shop, surrounded by his tools, his head in his hands. He wasn't crying. Thomas never cried. But his shoulders shook with a silent, racking grief. He was mourning the loss of himself. "I can't, Margaret," he whispered, his voice thick. "My hands, they don't listen anymore." I helped him up, and he leaned on me, this strong man who had always been my rock. As I helped him lock the door to the boatyard for the last time, I felt a chapter of our life, the longest and most important one, closing forever. His world shrank to the four walls of our little house. He would sit for hours in his chair by the window, watching the gulls circle over the harbor, his once powerful hands lying useless in his lap. The silence between us shifted again. It was no longer the silence of estrangement, but of shared helplessness. He was stripped of his defenses, of the work he had hidden behind for so long. There was nothing left but the two of us and the vast, unspoken history that lay between us. It was I who made the call. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I called Rose in Boston. I didn't plead or demand. I just told her the simple truth. "Your father is sick," I said. "He can't work anymore. I think you should come home." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought she would make an excuse. Then, her voice, smaller than I had heard it in years, just said, "I'll be on the next train." She arrived the next day, a different woman from the girl who had left. She was 35 years old, with lines of worry around her eyes that I'd never seen before. When she saw her father, frail and diminished in his chair, the brittle anger she had carried for so long just shattered. She knelt by his chair and took his hand, and for the first time since she was a little girl, she wept. Thomas, his own eyes wet, just stroked her hair with his trembling fingers. The war was over. What followed was not a miracle cure. It was a slow, painful, and achingly beautiful reconciliation. Rose stayed. She took a leave of absence from her job at the gallery. She moved back into her childhood bedroom. And she helped me care for him. The vast, silent ocean that had separated her from her father for so long began to recede, leaving behind a new landscape for them to explore. They didn't talk about the past, not in any direct way. There were no grand apologies or dramatic confessions. Their healing came in small moments. Rose would read to him, just as I once had, her voice filling the quiet room. He would listen, his eyes closed. She brought out old photo albums, and they would look at pictures of a time when things were simpler, when she was a little girl with sawdust in her hair. One day, she went into the boatyard and came back with the small, perfectly carved sandpiper he had given her as a child. She had kept it all these years. She placed it in his hand. He closed his fingers around it, a faint smile touching his lips. It was an apology, a peace treaty, an "I love you," all without a single word. He faded slowly, like a long, lingering sunset over the water. His last weeks were peaceful. He was no longer the proud, remote craftsman or the hurt, silent father. He was just a man at the end of his voyage, surrounded by the two women he loved. One afternoon, the three of us were sitting in the living room, the window open to the salt-laced breeze. Rose was holding his hand. He turned his head and looked at me, his eyes clear and calm. "You were my true north, Margaret," he whispered. It was the most poetic thing he had ever said. He passed away in his sleep a few nights later. The house, which had been filled with the quiet energy of our reunion, fell utterly silent. But this time, it was different. We were not alone in our grief. Rose and I held each other, two survivors on a quiet shore. Now, years later, I am the one who sits in the chair by the window. Rose moved back to Port Blossom. She didn't take over the boatyard, but she opened a small art gallery in town, a place that brings a little bit of her world into his. We are close, she and I, bound by our shared love for the quiet man who shaped our lives. Sometimes, I walk down to the old workshop. It stands just as he left it, covered in a fine layer of dust. The half-finished skeleton of a dory still rests on its supports. His tools lie on the workbench, waiting for the hands that will never hold them again. And in the corner, covered by a gray, weather-beaten tarp, is the wild rose. Rose and I have never had the heart to move it. It is a part of our story, a reminder that love is not always a calm sea. Sometimes it's a storm. Sometimes you get lost. Sometimes you have to fight the wind and the tide to find your way back. Thomas built things that were meant to last, things that could withstand the worst the ocean could throw at them. And in the end, that's what he did with our family. We were battered. We were broken. But he built our foundation strong enough to endure. He left behind more than just boats. He left behind a legacy of strength, resilience, and a love as deep and as constant as the tide itself. His story is not just in his hands, it's in the town, it's in my daughter, and it's in every single memory I hold in the quiet harbor of my heart. The smell of rain on dry earth, my Henry always called it petrichor. He loved words like that, obscure words for ordinary miracles. He said it was the smell of a promise kept, the sky finally giving back what it had taken. Here on the plains of Kansas, you learn to live by such promises. You learn to read the sky like a book, to feel the shift in the wind, to wait. Henry was a man made of that same patience. His whole life was an act of faith, a quiet, stubborn belief in the soil beneath his feet and the vast, unpredictable sky above. He was a farmer. And our love story wasn't written in letters or whispered in poems. It was plowed into this land, row by patient row, season by season, for 57 years. I wasn't born to this life. I came to the small town of Prairie Ridge as a schoolteacher, a young woman full of books and idealistic notions. My world was blackboards and chalk dust, the tidy confines of a classroom. His world was the horizon, an endless expanse of earth and sky that humbled you with its sheer scale. I saw him for the first time at a town potluck, held in the church basement. He wasn't talking to anyone, just standing by the window, looking out at the setting sun as it set the wheat fields on fire. He was not handsome in the way of movie stars. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that weren't from age, but from a lifetime of squinting at the horizon. His hands were large and calloused, stained with the earth, but they were gentle. I saw him later that evening helping old Mrs. Gable with her heavy casserole dish, his movements slow and careful. There was a stillness about him, a deep-rooted calm that made the chatter and noise of the room seem trivial. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the grain elevators that stood like sentinels on the edge of town. Our meeting was as simple and unadorned as he was. My car, a rickety old sedan, had a flat tire on a dusty road miles from anywhere. And there he was, his pickup truck appearing like a mirage in the heat. He didn't say much. He just tipped his hat, assessed the situation with a quiet competence, and changed the tire in under 10 minutes. When I tried to thank him, he just gave a small, shy smile and said, "Ma'am, out here, we're all each other has." That was Henry. His kindness wasn't a performance, it was a fundamental part of his nature, as essential as the rain. I started seeing him around town. He'd be at the feed store, or the hardware shop, always with that same quiet dignity. Our courtship wasn't a whirlwind. It was a slow germination, like one of his winter wheat seeds buried under the snow, waiting for the right time to grow. He started leaving things for me on the porch of the little house I rented. A jar of my favorite wildflower honey from his hives. A basket of the sweetest summer tomatoes I had ever tasted. A perfectly formed bird's nest he'd found in a fallen tree. He never left a note. He didn't have to. It was his way of speaking. He finally got up the courage to ask me to go for a drive one Sunday. We didn't go to a movie or a diner. He drove me out to his farm. His family's farm. Miles and miles of land that rolled and swelled like a golden ocean. We sat on the tailgate of his truck and watched the sunset. He started to talk, and I realized that this silent man was full of a deep, abiding wisdom. He didn't talk about politics or town gossip. He talked about the soil, about the way the different grasses held the moisture, about the patterns of the migrating birds. He spoke of the land as if it were a living, breathing entity, a partner in the dance of his life. My great-grandfather broke this sod, he told me, his voice soft but full of a quiet pride. He and my grandmother lived in a sod house, right over that rise. This land, it's in my blood, Clara. It's who I am. I looked at his face, illuminated by the last rays of the sun, and I saw not just a farmer, but a steward, a guardian of a legacy written in dirt and determination. And in that moment, I fell in love. I fell in love with his stillness, his strength, and his profound connection to the world. He proposed to me in the spring, as the first green shoots of wheat were pushing through the soil. He didn't have a diamond ring. He took me to a small, unplowed patch of earth behind the farmhouse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of seeds. "This is all I have to offer, Clara," he said, his voice earnest and a little shaky. "A life of hard work. And a whole lot of faith. But I promise I'll love you with everything I've got. Will you plant a life with me?" He opened my palm and poured the tiny, precious seeds into it. They felt warm from his hand. I closed my fingers around them, and I said yes. We were married in the same little church where we'd first seen each other. I moved into the old farmhouse, a sturdy, simple home that had seen 4 generations of his family born and raised within its walls. It smelled of old wood, baking bread, and the faint, clean scent of the prairie wind. My life of chalk, dust, and books was over. My new life was measured in seasons, in the planting and the harvest. I learned to drive a tractor, to mend fences, to read the clouds. It was the hardest work I had ever known. But at the end of each long day, sitting on the porch with Henry, watching the stars blaze in a sky uncluttered by city lights, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose I had never known before. We were building something together. Not just a farm, but a life. And soon, our life was to become richer than we could have ever imagined. Our son, Daniel, was born during the harvest moon, a healthy, happy baby with his father's serious eyes. The quiet farmhouse was filled with a new sound, a new joy. Henry would hold him, his rough farmer's hands impossibly gentle, and look at me with a love so profound it needed no words. We had our family. We had our land. We felt invincible. There's a saying out here on the plains, the sky gives, and the sky takes away. For the first 10 years of our son Daniel's life, the sky gave. The rains came when they were supposed to, the sun shone, and the wheat grew tall and golden. They were good years, fat years, filled with the steady rhythm of hard work and the deep satisfaction of a successful harvest. Our life wasn't easy, but it was good. Daniel grew up strong and capable, his father's shadow in the fields. He learned to drive the combine before he could properly see over the steering wheel, his small hands expertly guiding the massive machine. Henry was a proud father, though he rarely said the words. His pride was in the quiet moments, watching Daniel fix a piece of machinery, or correctly guessing when a storm was about to break. He was teaching our son the language of the land, the same language his own father had taught him. I saw the future of the farm in my son's eyes, the continuation of a legacy that felt as solid and real as the earth itself. We were a unit, the three of us, a small, strong family weathering the seasons together. But the sky is a fickle partner. The change was so gradual at first we barely noticed it. A spring that was a little too dry. A summer that was a little too hot. The rains, which had always been so reliable, became shy, then scarce. The year Daniel turned 11, the promise of rain turned into a constant, empty threat. Clouds would build on the horizon, dark and bruised, teasing us with the scent of ozone, only to break apart and vanish, leaving the sky a cruel, brilliant blue. That was the beginning of the drought. It wasn't a single event, it was a slow, creeping thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, leaving it cracked and gray. It stole the green from the corn stalks, turning them into brittle, yellow skeletons. It stole the hope from my husband's eyes. The first year, we told ourselves it was just a bad season. The second year, we started to worry. By the third year, the worry had turned into a cold, hard knot of fear that lived in the pit of my stomach. The farm, once a place of vibrant life, became a landscape of dust and despair. The wind, which had once been a friend that whispered through the tall wheat, became an enemy. It picked up the dry topsoil and hurled it against the house, a constant, gritty assault. The dust was everywhere. It was in our food, in our water, in our lungs. It coated every surface, a fine, brown powder that served as a constant reminder of our failure. This slow, relentless disaster changed my Henry. The quiet, patient man I had married began to disappear, replaced by a grim, silent stranger. He would wake before dawn and work until long after I had gone to bed, a frantic, desperate war against an enemy he could not see. He'd come into the house covered in dust, his face a mask of exhaustion and defeat, and he would barely speak a word. The easy companionship we had shared vanished. We were two people living in the same house, but he was lost on a barren island of his own grief, and I couldn't find a way to reach him. The drought was hardest on him because the farm wasn't just his livelihood, it was his identity. To watch it wither and die was to watch a part of himself die. He felt the failure personally, as if the dry sky were a judgment on him, on his worth as a man, as a farmer, as a husband and father. He grew thin, the lines on his face deepening into canyons of worry. The land he had loved was betraying him, and he didn't know how to fight back. And Daniel watched it all. He saw the toll it was taking on his father, on our family. The land that had been his playground became a source of anxiety. He started to hate it. He hated the dust, he hated the endless, back-breaking work that yielded nothing, and most of all, he hated what it was doing to his father. He started talking about leaving, about going to college in the city, about a life where your success didn't depend on the whims of the weather. This was a betrayal Henry couldn't bear. "This land is your birthright," he would say to Daniel, his voice rough with a pain he couldn't hide. "You don't just walk away from it." And Daniel would shout back, his young voice cracking with frustration, "It's not a birthright, Dad, it's a prison. It's killing you." Their arguments were like flashes of lightning in our otherwise silent house, illuminating the deep, painful chasm that had opened up between them. I was caught in the middle, loving them both, understanding them both, but powerless to bridge the gap. The bank sent letters, first polite, then firm, then threatening. We were falling behind. The debts were piling up like the dust drifts against the fences. The day the foreclosure notice arrived felt like the end of the world. I found Henry in the barn, just sitting on a hay bale, staring at the piece of paper in his hand. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a man completely and utterly broken. The legacy his great-grandfather had started, the one he was meant to pass on to his son, was turning to dust in his hands. He looked up at me, his eyes empty. "I lost it, Clara," he whispered. "I lost it all." In that moment, watching the strongest man I had ever known crumble, I knew that my own faith couldn't waver. If we were going to survive, I would have to find a new way forward. I would have to be the one to find the rain. Hope can arrive in the most unexpected forms. For us, it didn't come as a dark cloud full of rain, but as a shiny sedan kicking up dust on our long driveway. A man in a crisp suit got out, looking entirely out of place in our parched world. He represented a wind energy company. He had maps and charts, and he spoke of a different kind of harvest, one that didn't rely on the soil, but on the very wind that had been tormenting us for years. He wanted to lease a section of our highest ridge, a piece of land that was too rocky to farm anyway, to build wind turbines. The idea was sacrilege to Henry. To him, the land was for one thing, growing food. The thought of these giant, modern machines on his ancestral property felt like a deep and profound violation. He saw it as a surrender, an admission that he had failed as a farmer. "They're not crops, Clara," he argued, his voice full of a weary anger. "They're monuments to our failure. I won't do it." But I saw it differently. I saw a lifeline. I saw a way to pay the bank, to hold on to our home, to give my husband a chance to breathe again. We fought about it for weeks, our first real, bitter arguments in all our years together. I had to be strong, stronger than I ever thought I could be. I had to make him see past his pride. One night, I sat him down at the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice lying between us. "Henry," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. "Your great-grandfather broke this odd so his family could survive. He adapted. He did what he had to do. This is our time to adapt. Is your pride worth more than this house? More than our family? More than Daniel's future?" Something in him broke that night. Not in a bad way, but in a way that let the light in. He finally saw the truth in my words. He looked at my hands, worn and chapped from years of work, and he took them in his. He finally signed the papers, his signature a little shaky, like a man signing away a part of his soul. The construction of the turbines was a strange and noisy intrusion into our quiet life. But with the first lease check, we paid off the most pressing debts. The cloud of foreclosure lifted. The relief was a physical thing, like a great weight being lifted from our shoulders. Henry didn't suddenly become happy. But the frantic desperation left his eyes. He started sleeping through the night again. He started to talk to me again, not just about the debts and the drought, but about little things. The way he used to. Daniel left for college that fall. It was a sad day, but it wasn't the angry, bitter departure we had all feared. The night before he left, I saw him and Henry out by the barn, just talking. I don't know what they said, but when they came in, the tension that had defined their relationship for years was gone. Daniel hugged his father, a real, heartfelt hug. "I'll be back to visit, Dad," he said. And Henry, his voice thick with emotion, just clapped him on the shoulder and said, "I know you will, son." The wind turbines hadn't just saved our farm, they had saved our family. The rains did eventually return, as they always do. The land, thirsty and grateful, drank it in and began to heal. The fields turned green again. Henry started farming again, not with the frantic desperation of before, but with a quiet, renewed sense of purpose. He never learned to love the turbines. He'd call them the giants. But I would sometimes see him looking up at their huge, graceful blades turning slowly against the blue sky, and I think, in his own way, he made his peace with them. They were a part of our story now, a symbol of our survival. Our later years were quiet and gentle. Daniel built a good life for himself in the city as an engineer. He never came back to farm, but he came back often. He brought his wife, and then our grandchildren, two beautiful girls who loved the open spaces of the farm. Watching Henry teach his granddaughters how to find the North Star, or how to tell the difference between a hawk and a falcon, was a gift I will treasure forever. The legacy he passed on wasn't the land itself, but the love for it. The years of hard labor eventually caught up with Henry. His body, once so strong, began to fail him. His heart grew weak. The last few years of his life were spent mostly on the porch, in his favorite rocking chair, looking out over the fields. I cared for him, just as he had always cared for me, for the land. It was my turn to be the strong one. We didn't talk much about the past, about the hard times. We didn't need to. It was all there in the shared silence between us, in the simple touch of his hand on mine. He passed away in the early morning, just as the sun was rising over his fields. It was peaceful. He just closed his eyes and went to sleep. The silence he left behind was immense, as vast as the prairie sky. Now, I am an old woman, and the farmhouse is quiet again. But it's not an empty quiet. It's filled with the echoes of a long life, well lived. I look out the window, and I see him everywhere. I see him in the neat rows of wheat, in the sturdy old barn, in the faces of my grandchildren. I even see him in the slow, steady turning of the giant turbines on the ridge. They stand as a testament to our struggle, but also to our love, and our willingness to change. Sometimes, when I'm feeling lonely, I walk out onto the porch when a storm is brewing. I close my eyes and I wait. And then it comes, that first, cool splash of rain on the thirsty ground. And with it, that smell. The smell of a promise kept. Petrichor. And I can almost hear Henry's voice on the wind, telling me that even after the longest drought, the sky always remembers. The land endures. And so does love.